For the second time in less than 2 weeks, South Korea's military has fired warning shots after soldiers from North Korea crossed into the demilitarized zone. The South Korean Joint Chiefs of Staff says it doesn't think the breach was intentional. About 20 to 30 soldiers crossed the military demarcation line early on Tuesday. They retreated back into North Korea after the warning shots. Meanwhile, North Korea is rolling out the red carpet for Vladimir Putin. The streets of Pyongyang are lined with Russian flags and banners of the Russian president. He's expected to arrive in the next few hours for his first visit in many years. But the trip is raising concern with the US and its Western allies about North Korea's military support for Russia's war in Ukraine. Live to CNN's Ivan Watson, following developments for us from Hong Kong. And the US very clear that they don't object to the visit. Russia can do what they like, so can North Korea, but they are very concerned about what it means for Ukraine.
Absolutely. Right now, Vladimir Putin, according to Russian state media, is conducting a stopover in Yakutsk. That's a Russian city in Siberia. And after some time there, he's expected to then fly on to Pyongyang, where we believe he should arrive sometime Tuesday evening, Tuesday night for this visit. The Kremlin has made it clear, a Kremlin aide has said that the Russian and North Korean sides are expected to sign a new strategic partnership agreement. They have had drafts, versions of this in past decades. But in an open letter that Putin wrote and that has been published in the North Korean state media, we see signs of two governments, two leaders who are drawing closer together. And it does seem to revolve around Vladimir Putin and his now more than 2-year-old war in Ukraine, though he uses a very different term for it. If you look at the letter, quote, "We highly appreciate the DPRK's unwavering support for Russia's special military operation in Ukraine." Again, more than 2 years since Russia invaded Ukraine. He goes on to write that Pyongyang was and remains our staunch, like-minded ally and supporter, ready to resolutely resist the desire of the collective West to prevent the formation of a multipolar world order based on justice. What we're hearing here is the rhetoric of Moscow very much echoing the kind of ideology and rhetoric that North Korea has espoused and proclaimed for decades, for generations, of kind of the U.S. being this sinister force that's trying to dominate the world order. And now North Korea and the Pyongyang regime sounds very much ideologically aligned with Vladimir Putin's government. So what does that mean going forward? The U.S. has accused North Korea of supplying Russia with conventional weapons, things like artillery rounds and rockets that the White House is accusing Russia of using to kill Ukrainians on the battlefield. We do know that Vladimir Putin's military was not prepared initially for a war of attrition in Ukraine and has been looking for munitions from allies like North Korea. Pyongyang and Moscow deny these accusations of weapons transfers, but something's clearly going on between these two countries. And one of the big questions that the State Department has raised is what could North Korea be getting in return? After all, it is one of the world's most isolated countries. Max.
Yeah. Claire, in terms of how Russia's looking at this, I mean, it's an opportunity, isn't it, to increase its sphere of influence as much as, you know, getting these weapons deals done?
Yeah, I mean, I think the optics do matter, of course, coming off that huge week that we saw last week for Ukraine's Western Alliance, with the Reconstruction Conference in Berlin, the G7, then the Peace Summit in Switzerland. This is a chance for Russia to show that it's not isolated as a result of the war in Ukraine. President Putin, by the way, just also had a phone call with Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa, which was one of the holdouts from that communique at the Ukrainian Peace Summit. So they're very much going for these sort of on-the-fence, non-aligned countries trying to build up their own alliances, and the optics of President Putin's face lining the streets, these posters lining the streets of Pyongyang, will help with that. But I think concretely it's about, for the West and the concerns that we see from the US, it's about the potential quid pro quo here. Take a listen to National Security spokesman John Kirby on this issue.
What we are concerned about, Trevor, is the deepening relationship between these two countries. not just because of the impacts it's going to have on the Ukrainian people, because we know North Korean ballistic missiles are still being used to hit Ukrainian targets, but because there could be some reciprocity here that could affect security on the Korean Peninsula.
So it's what North Korea could get in return. And in fact, I think it's fair to say we have already seen some of that quid pro quo. Russia vetoed the extension of a mandate of a panel of experts at the UN who monitor violations of North Korea's UN sanctions. That mandate has now expired. Those sanctions violations are not being monitored. So North Korea now has this sort of powerful ally, a permanent member on the UN Security Council that makes future sanctions very unlikely, and then it raises further questions about what else Moscow could be doing in return for these weapons deliveries to support potentially North Korea's nuclear program.
It makes Russia look stronger, this sort of event, doesn't it? Particularly when we're getting all the pictures out of North Korea. Does it make the West look weaker?
So I think, look, Russia is clearly going wherever it can to seek these alliances. I think it's not necessarily true that seeking a kind of an alliance from the most isolated country in the world, this pariah state of North Korea, makes them look stronger. But certainly that is the message they're hoping to project home. You know, state media, all the sort of powerful sort of spokespeople for President Putin that you see, the news anchors, they're all putting out videos that show these images of his face lining the streets. So this is very much about the optics, as I said, to be able to project at home that he is, rather than being weakened by the war in Ukraine, is actually growing in influence. And if you look at the battlefield, that stands up as well. There's no reason at this point, given that Russia has very much the initiative on the ground in Ukraine, for them to stop with the fighting and stop seeking new defence partnerships.
Claire Sebastian, thank you so much. Also, Ivan in Hong Kong.
Joining us now is retired Army Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, who served as former Director for European Affairs at the National Security Council during the Trump administration. Colonel Vindman, always great to see you. Tell us about this meeting. I mean, what do you think? What should we expect?
Thanks, Jim. Always good to be on with you. This is, what I find interesting about this is the stark contrast to the recent flurry of activity in support of Ukraine. There was a very, very large-scale summit, a peace summit, in which Ukraine was able to marshal the democratic world, 80 signatories to a peace plan proposal, or at least a course for towards peace. Before that, a G7 with a large number of bilateral security agreements, a $50 billion pledge towards Ukraine, a loan package that Ukraine is going to be able to tap into for its defense, all sorts of resources pouring in to support Ukraine's war effort. And on the battlefield, Ukraine is holding its own. It's actually starting to make tactical counterattacks and take back territory and really punish the Russian forces, stymieing Russia's offensive. What does Putin do? He reciprocates a visit that Kim Jong-un paid to Russia last year, and he's there kind of hand out, asking for additional resources, additional artillery shells. He'll get some 30-40% of that artillery is ineffective, is pretty much useless, and he's going to go with his hand out around to the authoritarian world, to Iran with its drones that it's providing, but that's not going to amount to much. And the stark contrast is what's amazing. This is a guy that's positioned himself as a world leader. He can't travel anywhere. He's a hermit because he's been there's a warrant for his arrest, and he's going to the hermit kingdom.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the questions that I have, is whether this speaks to some kind of desperation on his part. Colonel Vindman, you and I have been talking about this for some time now. There was a lot of concern that the Ukrainians, because they were waiting for so long for support, military aid from places like the United States, places like Europe, that was going to give Russia the upper hand. But now we see Putin going almost hat in hand to the North Koreans.
That's exactly right. It's amazing, how quickly things have turned. We passed a Ukraine aid bill that the Democrats have been trying to force, that the Biden administration has been trying to move on for months, in September of 2023, being held up by Speaker Johnson and Trump. And some 8 weeks ago, this Ukraine aid bill passed, and immediately aid started flooding. back into Ukraine. And right away, you see those effects on the battlefield. Ukraine is holding its own. It's actually has in certain areas a artillery superiority. The Russians are no longer able to launch massive barrages, follow those with these human wave attacks and gain any ground. The Ukrainians are fighting quite effectively. I'm now slightly more optimistic, but it just does show the indispensable nature of this nation. And if we have a Trump administration come back starting next year, if Trump wins in November, you'll see the likes of Donald Trump visiting with Kim Jong Un and Putin instead of what Biden's been doing, rallying the G7, rallying the democratic world to advance the interests of democracy.